In this video, we're going to explore the orchestra that Havergal Brian used for the Gothic Symphony, and how it's both a building on tradition and something really entirely new. First, we need to take a look at Brian's influences. As in the last video, Sir Henry Wood is the person who gave Brian the suggestion to create a massive work that uses all the old and the new instruments. But we really can't say that Henry Wood is Brian's primary influence. His primary influence is Hector Berlioz. Remember, Brian hallucinated visions of Berlioz late into the night while working on the Gothic. In particular, we need to look at three works of Berlioz, one literary and two musical. The first is, of course, his Treatise on Instrumentation. We also need to look at Berlioz's Requiem, his largest work, and his Te Deum. Incidentally, Brian's Gothic Symphony uses the Te Deum as its primary text. Brian is, of course, also influenced by Richard Strauss, to whom the Gothic Symphony is dedicated, and he really relies heavily upon Strauss's additions to Berlioz's treatise. And another source that we can look at is Cecil Forsyth's Orchestration. This is the newest textbook in orchestration at the time, and it outlines some of the instruments that Brian is going to be using. But I think a good place to start is we need to compare Brian's Gothic Symphony to Gustav Holst's Planets. Brian very likely had a lot of influence from the Planets, particularly for the instrumentation of Part 1. Part 1 is considerably smaller than the gigantic Part 2. The orchestra sizes are very similar to one another. In fact, they're only within a few players of one another in terms of size. The Planets premiered in 1918, and the Gothic was begun in 1919, so right in the same time frame. It has to be a direct influence. And many of Holst's quirky instruments are also used by Brian. And what I mean by quirky instruments are things like alto flute, bass oboe, things along those lines. So let's first start off and compare the woodwinds. So this is Holst's setup. He uses 4 flutes, and flute number 3 also plays piccolo. Flute number 4 also plays piccolo and alto flute. He uses 4 oboes. Oboe number 3 also plays bass oboe, and oboe number 4 is always on English horn. 4 clarinets, and the 4th clarinet is always on bass clarinet. 4 bassoons, and the 4th bassoon is always on contrabassoon. Compare this to Brian, and it's nearly identical with only 2 extra players. 4 flutes, flute 3 on piccolo, flute 4 on alto flute. Incidentally, both Brian and Holst call the alto flute a bass flute. 5 oboes. Here is 1 extra player. We have 3. Oboe 3 is on oboe d'amore. Oboe 4 is on English horn, and oboe 5 is on bass oboe. The oboe d'amore is the only additional instrument here, which, incidentally, Holst did use in his earlier work, Somerset Rhapsody. 5 clarinets. This is, again, 1 more than Holst uses. An E-flat clarinet, 2 B-flat or A clarinets, basset horn, and bass clarinet. Holst does not use the E-flat clarinet, nor does he use the basset horn. However, Holst will use E-flat clarinet in other works, but he never uses the basset horn. This is, in fact, one of the few British works that will use basset horn. And 4 bassoons, and 4th bassoon is always on contrabassoon, identical to Holst's. Now let's look at the brass. Again, we'll find very similar groupings. Holst has 6 horns, 4 C trumpets, 2 tenor and a bass trombone, and a tenor and a bass tuba. Tenor tuba, by the way, just another name for the euphonium. Brian, and again, only part 1 here, uses 6 horns, and here's one slight change. He uses an E-flat cornet. E-flat cornet would have been the highest available brass instrument at the time. Piccolo trumpet was not available, but E-flat cornet was commonly used in all the brass bands. Brian is still calling for F trumpets, though by this time the British orchestras had pretty much all switched to B flat or C trumpets. 3 tenor trombones, so he's not using bass trombone here, though he will later on, and he's using 2 tubas. Now the score says 2 bass tubas, but at looking at the parts, the second tuba part really should be played on a contrabass tuba as it descends at least to C sharp 1, which would be really getting to be out of range for the British F tuba at the time. Strings, percussion, harps, and others. By and large, they're pretty much identical between the two groups. Both use 2 harps, celesta, organ, large string section. The biggest difference is actually Holst's section is a little bit bigger. He uses 2 timpanists. But let's get to part 2, because part 2 is where we have no holds barred. Part 2, Brian takes his influence from Strauss's update to Berlioz's treatise. And there's a couple pages in particular. It's actually in the page where he's talking about the bassoon. And he's talking about some newer additions to the woodwind section. We will look at those more in detail in the next couple slides. But we really clearly see where Brian gets the ideas for how to form his orchestra from Strauss's updates. And there are some errors in the printed score, which means that the actual size of the orchestra is a little bit smaller than the numbers commonly given. And we'll go over some of those as well. So let's look first at the flutes. And we're going to compare Brian's flute section to the flute section that Richard Strauss lays out in the Berlioz treatise. So Brian's flute section is actually pretty simple. 2 piccolos, 5 C flutes, and an alto flute. And the alto flute equals flute 6. Were true bass flutes or actual tenor flutes available at the time? It is entirely possible to see Brian calling for that, but these are the flutes that were available at the time. Strauss's proposal is nearly identical to that. 2 piccolos, 4 C flutes, and 1 to 2 alto flutes. The only difference is Brian moves one of the alto flutes to C flute, and otherwise the two groups are the same. Oboes. Here again, we'll see some very similar ideas between Brian and Strauss. So this is Brian's ensemble. 4 oboes, 1 oboe d'amore, which also equals oboe 5, 2 English horns, 1 bass oboe, which equals oboe 6. However, if we look carefully at the score, one of the oboes could easily be deleted. There are only a handful of times when all 8 players play. They're always in massive 2D sections, and the parts are almost always doubled. So if we carefully rewrite the parts, what would be technically oboe 3 could be eliminated, and we just keep the rest of our doublings together, and we can eliminate 1 player here. So we're really only dealing with 7 oboists. This is what Strauss proposed. 4 oboes, 2 oboes d'amore, 2 English horns, a heckelphone, and a contrabass oboe. Only a few slight differences here. A second oboe d'amore. He has heckelphone instead of bass oboe. Heckelphone was used in Germany at the time. Bass oboe was known in England. And then the contrabass oboe. Oddly, the contrabass oboe still does not exist to this day. Making it one of those curiosities that Strauss talks about. Says he even heard one, but we have no evidence to that. Let's go to our clarinets. So this is what Brian uses. 2 E-flat clarinets. They also equal B-flat clarinets 4 and 5. 3 B-flat clarinets, 2 basset horns, 2 bass clarinets, and a B-flat contrabass clarinet. And believe it or not, if we look at this, this actually looks very similar to a large wind band setup. This is what Strauss proposed, and we can see why Brian actually went smaller than Strauss and deviated from his proposal. So Strauss called for 1 A-flat clarinet and 2 F clarinets. A-flat clarinet was pretty much unknown in England, and the F clarinet has been extinct since probably before 1850. 2 E-flat clarinets, which Brian uses, 4 to 6 B-flat clarinets, and Brian is close to that. He actually uses 5 total, but 2 of those are the E-flats. 2 bass horns, 1 bass clarinet. Brian actually ups that to 2, and then 1 contrabass clarinet. Bassoons and horns, we don't really have that big of a difference from normal here. 3 bassoons and 2 contrabassoons. That's actually the same ensemble that the Rite of Spring uses. And same with the 8 horns. In fact, if we look at all of Strauss's works, this is not out of the ordinary for what Strauss would have written, with the exception Strauss never wrote for 2 contrabassoons. Stravinsky did, Mahler did in Symphony 10, and a few other composers, but the second contrabassoon is the only real deviation here with bassoons and horns. Let's move on to trumpets, cornets, and trombones. So this is Brian's ensemble. 2 E-flat cornets, 4 F trumpets. Now there are a few passages where we have 8 trumpets, but those are generally doubled. They can be taken from the brass ensembles, which we'll look at in just a little bit, but the majority of the entire second part can be done on just 4 trumpets and a bass trumpet. For the trombones, we have 3 tenor trombones, a bass trombone, and the bass trombone here, Brian is probably writing for an F bass trombone, though the G bass trombone was used in England at the time. And the only reason we can say that he's using an F bass over the G bass is there are a few B naturals, low B natural 1. And, of course, contrabass trombone. And with the exception of the 2 E-flat cornets, this is not unlike anything that we would expect from Strauss. This is very similar to something that we'd see maybe out of Electra. Tubas. Now, here is where we get a little bit different. So Brian includes 2 euphoniums and 2 tubas. And as per part 1, while it says bass tuba in the score, it's most likely a bass and a contrabass tuba. Richard Strauss never wrote for this many. He only ever wrote for 2, but he did combinations of 2 bass tubas, 2 contrabass tubas, and a tenor and a bass tuba in various works. Where we can see some influence here is probably Brian's early exposure to British brass bands, where an ensemble like this would be very, very standard. But there are, of course, brass bands. And again, as I said just a moment ago, Brian had a lot of experience with the British brass bands. So there are 4 separate brass ensembles that augment the orchestra. Each support a semi-choir. The instrumentation of each is 2 horns, 2 trumpets, 2 trombones, 2 tubas, and a set of 3 timpani. It brings a total of 9 players per each brass ensemble. This is actually taken from Berlioz's Requiem, where he has 4 separate brass ensembles, each placed around the orchestra. So Brian is just taking this same idea that Berlioz had 70 years earlier and just updating it. He's also using fewer players, too, than Berlioz did. However, there is a problem in the printed score in a lot of the sections where the brass ensembles come in that they're all put on one line. So it's all the horns for all 4 ensembles, all the trumpets, all the trombones, all the tubas, and it just says 8. And there's no real way to know how they've been separated out. There's only a few places in the score where all 4 ensembles are separated out. Choruses and soloists. There are 2 adult mixed choruses. Double choruses are not uncommon in larger works. We can see this going back into the Renaissance era to have double choruses. But each chorus here is split into chorus A and B. So you have 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, which separate and essentially act as 4 choirs. However, they really are just 2, but slightly subdivided. There's also a children's chorus that sings a little bit in movement 4 and movement 6. However, they are not that prominent throughout the work. This is an identical choral arrangement to Berlioz's Te Deum, where he has 2 choruses and a children's chorus. So as we can see from the very beginning of our slides here, Brian is taking his direct influence from Berlioz. And we have soprano, alto, tenor, and bass soloists. The soprano, tenor, and bass all have very long solos, but the alto only sings in some quartet passages in movement 4 and sits silent throughout the rest of the work. Percussion. Here we just have a kind of a long list of percussion instruments. 2 sets of timpani. By the way, with the extra 4 sets of timpani from the brass bands, that brings our total to 6 sets of timpani. A glockenspiel, xylophone, an Indian long drum, which you hear a little bit in the movement 5, the Iudex Crederis, 2 bass drums, tambourine, cymbals, gong, thunder machine or thunder sheet, chimes, chains, and what Brian calls a bird scare, which is a ratchet. Left off of this list, and which was left off of the frontispiece of the printed score, are snare drums. So there's 2 snare drums as well. And then string section. Here we have a very large string section with harps and keyboards. So 2 harps, celesta, and organ, just like in part 1. And Brian gives us the ideal number of strings is 20 first, 20 seconds, 16 violas, 14 cellos, and 12 basses. This is a lot of string. So here's our total number of players. Woodwinds is 31, though we can take that down to 30 if we eliminate one of the oboe players. There's 24 brass in the orchestra. You can do this with a minimum of 8 percussionists. That includes your 2 timpanists and then 6 extra percussionists. Harps and keyboards, you need 4. It's 2 harps and then 2 keyboard players. Using Brian's numbers, we need 82 strings. In the 4 brass bands, there are 36 players, 9 in each. And that's a total of 149 or 148 in the main orchestra. And then total with the 4 brass bands, it's 185 players. This is a very, very large orchestra. But again, break it down. It's large, but you can see how the ideas kind of grew, and they're just building on ideas from the very end of the Romantic era. Now, I cannot call this piece a Romantic era work because it's something very much different than that, and we'll talk about that in a further video. And this number here of 185 does not include the choristers. And a good performance would probably want about 400 in the 2 adult choirs, so 100 in each of the 4 semi-choruses, and then another 100 in the children's choir. And that would bring us another 500 choristers. That's getting close to 700 performers just to perform this one symphony. A monster work. But that's the ensemble that Brian calls for, and it's one reason that it is not performed very often. It's never been performed in the United States. Maybe someday we can arrange a performance of it. But it would be very interesting to get, say, a big university together that has a big music program and get all the forces together and do this as like their big finale concert for the year. But anyway, let me know. Have you seen bigger pieces? There might be a few of them out there. You don't get a lot of pieces that combine this size and this length, which is one of the reasons that Brian's Gothic is so intimidating. But as always, like, comment, subscribe. Tell me what you think down below. And if you want to join us over on Patreon, head over to patreon.com/BrettNewtonComposer, and you can join us in the Discord, get early access to chapters from my upcoming books, and maybe we'll be doing some score study classes coming up soon too. So until next time.